The bailiff's monotone called the court to order, but this was no ordinary day in Maple Creek. The woman who thought she'd already won her case was about to realize she wasn't suing a powerless landowner she was facing, Judge Mark Hayes himself. This is the story of arrogance colliding with authority, and the shocking moment when justice turns the tables. Hit like, subscribe for more stories that deliver true karma. None of this had even been a possibility in Judge Mark Hayes's well-ordered life. His world was divided into two distinct halves. There was the structured, demanding realm of the courthouse, a place of logic, law, and the heavy weight of human fallibility. And then there was his sanctuary, 40 acres of rolling hills and dense woods on the edge of the county, a property that had been in his family for 3 generations. The centerpiece of that land, and of his heart, was a small, hand-built cabin nestled in a grove of ancient oak trees. His grandfather, a man with hands as tough as leather and a soul as gentle as the forest itself, had built it with timber from their own land in 1952. For Mark, the cabin wasn't just a structure. It was a library of memories. He could still smell the lingering scent of his grandmother's apple pie, still hear the echo of his grandfather's booming laughter, still feel the rough-hewn wood of the walls that he had helped sand and stain as a boy. After a long week of wrestling with complex legal arguments and the often tragic stories of the people who passed through his courtroom, Mark would drive out to the property. He'd trade his judicial robes for flannel and denim, his gavel for a fishing rod or an old woodworking tool. The transition was a necessary balm for his spirit. He wasn't Judge Hayes out here. He was just Mark, the grandson of a carpenter, a man who found more truth in the straight grain of a plank of wood than in most legal testimonies. This particular Saturday began like any other. The sun was just starting to pierce through the morning mist, casting long, golden shafts of light through the trees. The air was crisp with the smell of damp earth and pine. With a steaming mug of black coffee in hand, Mark sat on the cabin's porch, listening to the symphony of the waking woods. It was a peace he cherished, a profound silence that stood in stark contrast to the adversarial noise of his professional life. He had no inkling that this peace was about to be systematically dismantled by a force as invasive and unwelcome as a weed in a well-tended garden. The first salvo in the war he didn't even know had been declared arrived that afternoon, not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of an envelope being slid into his mailbox down by the main road. Mark didn't check his mail at the property often. Most of his official correspondence went to his primary residence in town. The mailbox at the end of his long gravel driveway was mostly for the occasional flyer or a local newspaper. But as he drove out late that afternoon to get supplies, he saw the little red flag was up. Inside was a single, crisp, cream-colored envelope. The return address read, Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association. He frowned. He knew the sprawling, new money subdivision of identical McMansions had been built a few years ago on the parcel of land bordering his own, but he had no affiliation with them. His property was separate, deeded long before the first foundation was ever poured for their cookie-cutter community. He had never signed any covenant or agreed to any of their rules. He opened the letter with a sense of detached curiosity, expecting it to be some kind of misdirected welcome packet or an invitation to a neighborhood block party he had no intention of attending. The tone of the letter, however, was anything but welcoming. It was a formal notice, written in sterile, bureaucratic language. It has come to our attention, it began, that the grass and native foliage at the edge of your property facing Maple Creek Drive exceed the community standard height of 6 inches, as per bylaw 12A. Please rectify this issue within 14 days to avoid further action. Mark read it twice, a small, humorless laugh escaping his lips. They were complaining about the wildflowers and tall meadow grass that grew along the old stone wall, separating his ancestral land from their manicured, chemically treated lawns. The very idea was absurd. It was like sending a notice to the forest for having too many trees. He crumpled the letter in his fist. The notion of a community standard being imposed on his wild, untamed land, striking him as the height of arrogance. He tossed the wadded-up paper onto the passenger seat, dismissing it as the work of some overzealous board committee member with too much time on their hands. It was a mistake. He had underestimated the singular, obsessive focus of a petty tyrant. He had just met, on paper, the president of the Maple Creek Estates HOA, Mrs. Martha Miller. And she was not someone who tolerated being ignored. A week passed, and Mark promptly forgot about the ridiculous letter. He spent his time mending a section of the old stone wall his grandfather had built, enjoying the satisfying heft of the stones in his hands, and the simple, honest labor of it all. He was fitting a particularly stubborn piece of granite into place when a sleek, silver luxury SUV crunched to a halt on the gravel road behind him. He didn't have to turn around to know it wasn't one of the locals. The sound of the engine was too smooth, too quiet, too expensive. A car door opened and closed, with a soft, vacuum-sealed thud. "Excuse me." A sharp, imperious voice cut through the quiet afternoon air. Mark placed his stone, dusted off his hands on his jeans, and turned slowly. Standing there was a woman who looked utterly out of place. She was in her early 50s, rail-thin, and dressed in pristine white linen trousers and a silk blouse that probably cost more than his monthly grocery bill. Her blonde hair was coiffed into a helmet-like style that seemed immune to the breeze, and her face was a mask of perfectly applied makeup. It was clear she was the physical embodiment of the letter he had discarded. "Can I help you?" "We have," Mark asked, his tone neutral. "I am Martha Miller, president of the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association," she announced, as if presenting her credentials to a foreign dignitary. "I'm sure you received our notice." "The one about the grass," Mark said, letting a hint of amusement creep into his voice. "I did. And yet, the violation remains," she said, gesturing with a manicured hand toward the beautiful, unruly stretch of Queen Anne's lace and black-eyed Susans along his property line. "Our community values a neat, uniform appearance." "Well," Mark said, leaning back against his wall, "this isn't your community. This is my property, and I value the bees and the butterflies that live in those flowers." Martha's perfectly painted lips thinned into a hard line. Her eyes left the wildflowers and scanned his property, her gaze filled with disdain. They swept over the ancient trees, the rustic stone wall, and finally, they landed on the cabin, visible through a clearing. Her expression soured completely. "And that structure," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "What about it? Is it on the list for demolition? It's quite an eyesore. It drags down the aesthetic of the entire area." Mark's easygoing demeanor vanished, replaced by a cold, hard stillness. "That cabin," he said, his voice low and steady, "was built by my grandfather. It's been here for 70 years. And it will be here long after you and your community aesthetics are gone." He had drawn a line in the sand. Martha, in her arrogance, didn't just step over it. She prepared to dance on it. Martha's response was a condescending little laugh, a sound like ice cubes clinking in a glass. "Oh, sentimental value. That's quaint," she said, her tone utterly dismissive. "But sentiment doesn't supersede bylaws, mister." She paused, clearly not knowing or caring what his name was. "Hayes," Mark supplied, his voice flat. "Judge Mark Hayes. He didn't usually play the judge card in his private life. In fact, he actively avoided it. But something in her dismissive arrogance made him want to see if it would register, if it would give her a moment's pause. It didn't. The title seemed to bounce right off her shell of self-importance. If anything, her smirk only grew. "Well, Mr. Hayes." She stressed his name as if it were a common nuisance. "As I was saying, the HOA covenants apply to all properties within the Maple Creek Estate's purview, and our Architectural Review Committee has to approve all structures. All of them, especially dilapidated sheds like that one." Mark felt a slow burn of anger begin in his chest, but he kept his voice even, a skill honed by years on the bench. "First," he said, holding up a finger, "my property is not, nor has it ever been, part of your HOA. It is a separate, legally distinct parcel. You have no purview here." He held up a second finger. He held up a second finger. He held up a second finger. "Second, even if it were, that cabin is not a dilapidated shed. It's a historically significant structure that predates your entire subdivision by more than half a century. Any attempt to apply your new build rules retroactively would be legally unenforceable. He was giving her a free piece of legal advice, a clear warning shot. He was explaining, in plain terms, that she was on shaky ground. Martha simply waved a dismissive hand. "Lawyer speak. I'm not impressed. You'll find our HOA's legal team is very thorough. You see, when the land was zoned for our development, certain oversights were corrected. We have a very broad interpretation of community standards. You'll receive another notice, a formal one this time. I suggest you read this one more carefully." She turned on her heel, her expensive shoes crunching on the gravel, and got back into her silver cocoon. As she drove away, Mark watched her go, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. This wasn't about grass. This was about control. He was a loose thread in the perfect tapestry she was trying to weave, and she was the kind of person who wouldn't just pull a thread. She'd bring out the shears. True to her word, the second letter arrived 2 days later. This one came via certified mail, requiring a signature, a classic intimidation tactic designed to make the recipient feel the weight of officialdom. The envelope was thicker, the cream-colored paper heavier. The language inside was colder, sharper, and far more aggressive. It made no mention of the grass this time. Martha had moved on to her primary target. The letter, signed by her and the 2 other silent, rubber-stamping members of the HOA board, was a formal violation notice. It cited bylaw 7.4. C, a vaguely worded rule about unapproved, non-permanent, or auxiliary structures. It officially classified his grandfather's cabin as such and imposed an initial fine of $500. It went on to state that he had 30 days to submit a retroactive architectural review application, which would include a non-refundable $2,000 fee, or to remove the offending structure from the property. Failure to comply would result in escalating daily fines and further legal action, up to and including the placement of a lien on the property. Mark sat at the solid oak table his grandfather had built, the very table where he'd eaten countless meals as a child, and stared at the letter. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. They were trying to fine him, lien him, and force him to demolish his own family history based on the rules of a club he had never joined. The casual cruelty of the phrase, "remove the offending structure," felt like a physical blow. He knew, with the cold certainty of a seasoned legal professional, that her position was baseless. His property records were clear. The lack of any covenant on his deed was an indisputable fact, but he also knew that people like Martha didn't operate on facts. They operated on power, intimidation, and the assumption that most people, when faced with a blizzard of legal-sounding threats and the prospect of expensive lawyers, would simply fold. They would pay the fine, paint the mailbox, or, in this case, maybe even tear down a piece of their own soul just to make the problem go away. Martha Miller had made a critical miscalculation. Judge Mark Hayes was not most people. He wasn't going to fold. He was going to start building a case. Mark's first step was to retreat into his own world, the world of evidence and precedent. He went into the small, book-lined study in his house in town and began to assemble his defense, even though no formal legal action had been taken yet. He treated it as if he were preparing for a major trial. From a fireproof safe, he retrieved the original deed to the property, the parchment yellowed and brittle with age. The legal description was clear. The boundaries defined by old oaks and stone markers, with no mention of any homeowners association, present or future. It was a clean title, unencumbered. Next, he pulled out a collection of his grandfather's old journals. His grandfather wasn't a man of letters, but he was a man of records. In a neat, practical script, he had documented the construction of the cabin. June 1952. One entry read, "Finished setting the foundation piers. Solid rock beneath. This little house will stand for 100 years." Mark's hands traced over the faded ink. There were sketches of the framing, lists of materials, and notes about which neighbor had helped him raise the ridge beam. It was more than just a journal. It was a provenance, a detailed history that established the cabin's age and origin beyond any doubt. He took high-resolution photographs of every relevant page. He then logged on to the county's public records database. As a judge, He could navigate its archaic interface with an ease born of long practice. He pulled the plat maps for the Maple Creek Estate subdivision. Just as he suspected, his parcel was clearly delineated as separate, marked pre-existing residential, agricultural. He found the incorporation documents for the HOA itself, dated just 8 years prior. Finally, he searched for the bylaws Martha had cited. He found bylaw 7.4. C. It had been added to the HOA's governing documents only 6 months ago. At an emergency meeting, he now felt certain Martha had called for the sole purpose of creating a weapon to use against him. It was a textbook case of creating a rule specifically to target an individual. It was malicious, it was predatory, and for a woman who clearly saw herself as a queen of rules and order, it was incredibly sloppy. He saved every document, every screenshot, every photograph, into a meticulously organized folder on his computer. The foundation of his case was laid, as solid as the one his grandfather had set 70 years before. The next weekend, while working on the section of fence that ran parallel to the main road of the subdivision, an old pickup truck, the polar opposite of Martha's gleaming SUV, slowed to a stop. The driver was a man Mark recognized but didn't know well, Mr. Abernathy, an elderly farmer whose family had owned land in this valley even longer than Mark's. He was in his late 80s, with a face like a topographical map, and eyes that had seen a lifetime of changing seasons. "Morning, Mark," he called out, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Saw that silver shark of a car out here last week. Figured you might be getting the welcome wagon treatment from Queen Martha." Mark stopped his work and leaned against the fence post, a wry smile touching his lips. "You could call it that, Mr. Abernathy. She seems to have taken a dislike to my grandfather's cabin." Mr. Abernathy let out a dry, rattling laugh. "Son, that woman would take a dislike to a sunset if she couldn't fine it for being too orange. Let me tell you a story. You remember the Hendersons? Lived in that first house on the corner, the yellow one." Mark nodded. They had moved away a couple of years back. "Martha got them run out," Mr. Abernathy said, his expression turning serious. "Started with their mailbox. It was a shade of blue, she called unapproved. A fine. Then it was a garden gnome their little girl put in the flower bed. Lawn ornamentation violation. Another fine. It went on and on. Petty little cuts, one after another. She bled them dry with fines and lawyer letters until they couldn't take it anymore. They sold at a loss just to get away from her." He shook his head, a look of deep-seated disgust on his face. "She gets a thrill from it. It's not about the rules. It's about breaking people. She pushes and pushes until they snap, and then she feeds on the misery. A lot of folks in there are scared to death of her. They just pay up and shut up. Be careful, Mark. She doesn't fight fair." The old man's words were a stark warning. Mark had been viewing this as a legal chess match, a contest of logic and evidence. Mr. Abernathy had just reminded him that he wasn't playing against a rational opponent. He was facing a bully, and bullies don't care about the rules of the game. They only care about winning. Mark's resolve, already solid, hardened into granite. Mr. Abernathy's story had made it clear that this was a pattern, a systematic campaign of harassment. This wasn't just an attack on him. It was an abuse of power that had been terrorizing an entire community. His fight was no longer just about a cabin. It was about justice. The next time he drove out to the property, he found Martha's latest escalation. It was another notice, but this one wasn't in his mailbox. It was plastered directly onto the ancient, weathered oak of the cabin's front door, and it wasn't held by a simple piece of tape. She had used wide, heavy-duty industrial packing tape, the kind with fibrous reinforcement that is nearly impossible to remove cleanly. A surge of pure, cold fury washed over Mark. This was a desecration. That door had been hung by his grandfather. The deep grooves in the wood were a testament to decades of wind and rain. His own childhood handprints were likely still preserved somewhere in the grain, and she had smeared it with this cheap, ugly, modern adhesive. He approached the door slowly, his jaw clenched. The notice itself was more of the same, a final warning before legal action, its bureaucratic threats rendered almost comical by its thuggish placement. But the real message wasn't in the words, it was in the act itself. It was a violation meant to be seen and felt, a deliberate show of contempt for his history, his property, and his warnings. Carefully, he began to peel back a corner of the tape. It was just as he feared. The aggressive adhesive clung to the wood, pulling up splinters and a thin layer of the door's beautiful silvered patina. It was going to leave a permanent scar. He stopped immediately. He took out his phone and began to document everything. He took wide shots of the notice on the door, then close-ups of the tape, and then extreme close-ups of the damage it was causing to the wood fibers. Each photo was a piece of evidence. Each click of the shutter was another nail being hammered into Martha Miller's legal coffin. This was no longer just harassment. It was vandalism. She had crossed a critical line, and Mark knew exactly how to use that to his advantage. Back in his study, Mark sat down and drafted a formal letter. He wasn't writing now as a homeowner, but as the legal professional he was. The tone was devoid of emotion, a cold, precise instrument of the law. He addressed it to the Maple Creek Estates HOA Board of Directors, deliberately not singling Martha out, forcing the other members to be accountable. He began by stating, clearly and unequivocally, that his property was not subject to their authority and that their continued contact constituted legal harassment. He then detailed every interaction: the first notice, Martha's confrontational visit, the second certified letter with its baseless fines. The core of the letter, however, focused on the latest transgression. He attached the high-resolution, time-stamped photographs of the notice taped to his cabin door and the close-ups of the damage to the antique wood. He cited the relevant state statute for vandalism and destruction of property. "This act, he wrote, has elevated this matter from a civil disagreement over unfounded bylaws to a clear case of criminal property damage. The evidence has been preserved and documented." He then laid out his terms, framing them not as a request but as a final opportunity for them to mitigate their own legal jeopardy. "You will cease and desist all communication immediately," the letter stated. "You will issue a formal written apology for the harassment and the damage to my property. You will expunge all fines and retract all threats. Failure to comply with these demands in full within 10 business days will result in me pursuing all available legal and civil remedies, including but not limited to filing a formal police report for vandalism and initiating a lawsuit against the HOA and its board members, individually, for harassment and damages." He printed the letter, along with pristine color copies of the photographs, and sent it via courier, with signature confirmation required from every single board member. The game had changed. He had stopped defending and had started to attack. He was giving them one last chance to walk away from the fire they had started. For 9 days, there was silence. Mark half expected Martha to double down immediately, to fire back with a letter from her own lawyer full of bluster and counter-threats. But the deadline came and went with no response, no apology, no retraction, no contact whatsoever. It was an eerie quiet, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Mark knew this wasn't a retreat, it was a regrouping. Martha was not the type to admit defeat. She was stewing, plotting, and allowing her arrogance to convince her that his letter was nothing more than a bluff. On the 11th day, her answer arrived, and it was as decisive as it was foolish. Another certified letter. This one, however, was not from the HOA. It was from a downtown law firm, the kind with a fancy, embossed letterhead and a reputation for aggressive, high-priced litigation. The letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. It completely ignored his cease and desist, framing him as the aggressor, a non-compliant homeowner creating a nuisance. It formally rejected all of his claims and announced that the HOA board, under the fiduciary guidance of its president, Martha Miller, had voted to proceed. It stated that because he had refused to comply with the generous 30-day window to either remove the unapproved structure or submit it for review, the HOA was now officially demanding the cabin's removal. It went on to inform him that a new bylaw had been unanimously ratified at an emergency session. This bylaw granted the HOA the authority to declare any structure in violation for more than 60 days as abandoned community property, allowing them to seize it. Mark read that last part again, a slow, cold smile spreading across his face. It was perfect. It was legally insane, a complete fabrication of authority they didn't possess, but it was exactly what he needed. She had put her unhinged, criminal intent in writing, on her lawyer's letterhead. She had just handed him the murder weapon, covered in her own fingerprints. The letter concluded by stating that if the cabin was not demolished by him within a final 14 days, the HOA would file a lawsuit to seek a court order to take possession of the structure for immediate and necessary removal. She was actually going to take him to court. She was going to bring her flimsy, spiteful little war into his house, his arena. The irony was so thick he could almost taste it. Mark knew it was time to bring in his own professional ally. While he was more than capable of handling the legal side of things, he needed an official, third-party validation of his claims about the property. He called David Chen, an old friend from his university days who was now one of the most respected land surveyors in the state. "Dave," Mark said, after they'd exchanged pleasantries, "I've got a situation out at my grandfather's place. I'm dealing with a rather enthusiastic HOA president." He explained the situation. From the initial notice about the grass to the latest threat of a lawsuit to seize the cabin. David listened patiently, letting out a low whistle when Mark mentioned the abandoned community property clause. "Wow, Mark. That's not just legally baseless. That's a whole new level of crazy," David said. "It sounds like you need the works. A boundary survey, a historical affidavit for the structure, the whole 9 yards. Something ironclad that you can wave in a judge's face." "That's exactly what I need," Mark confirmed. "I need a report so clear and definitive that a first-year law student could see this for what it is. A malicious, targeted attack." "Consider it done," David said. "I can be out there on Saturday. We'll mark every corner, document every stone in that wall, and I'll pull the historical aerial maps from the county archives. By the time I'm finished, you'll have a report that proves not only that she has no claim, but that she would have had to know it from the public record. That moves it from a simple dispute to knowingly filing a frivolous claim." This was a crucial step. It wasn't just about proving he was right. It was about proving that Martha's actions were not a simple mistake or a misinterpretation of the rules. It was about establishing intent. A detailed professional survey would show that the information proving her wrong was easily and publicly available. Her decision to proceed with a lawsuit in the face of such obvious facts would be the very definition of malice in the eyes of the court. The pieces were all falling into place. That Saturday, David's truck, loaded with tripods, electronic measuring devices and rolls of plans, rumbled up Mark's driveway. They spent the morning walking the property line, with David planting brightly colored survey flags at the corners defined in the original deed. Mark watched him work, admiring his friend's precision and expertise. It was a comfort to have an ally, a professional who spoke the language of facts and figures. They were about halfway through their work when Martha's silver SUV appeared, crawling down the road like a stalking predator. It pulled to a stop, and she got out, her arms crossed, her face a thunderous scowl. She saw the survey equipment, and her eyes narrowed in suspicion. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice carrying across the field. "This is unapproved construction activity." Mark walked calmly to the edge of his property. "Good morning, Martha. This is a land survey. It's perfectly legal. And again, this is my property, not yours. Anything that affects the sightlines of our community requires a permit from the HOA," she snapped, inventing a new rule on the spot. "You are in violation." "There is no such rule," Mark said, his voice weary. "You're trespassing. I suggest you return to your vehicle." Instead of leaving, Martha pulled out her phone. "I'm reporting this to the authorities. I'm reporting an illegal encroachment and unauthorized development on HOA-adjacent land." Mark simply sighed. "Go ahead, Martha. Please, make the call. Create another official record of your harassment. I insist." She did. With a triumphant sneer, she spoke into her phone, her voice filled with fabricated urgency and outrage. She was reporting a hostile property owner, illegal construction, and potential boundary violations. It was a ridiculous, almost pathetic display of her need to control a situation that was rapidly slipping from her grasp. She was trying to use the police as her personal enforcers, another costly mistake in a growing list of them. Less than 20 minutes later, A county sheriff's patrol car pulled up behind Martha's SUV. Two deputies got out, a seasoned, older officer and a younger one. They looked tired, as if they'd rather be doing anything other than mediating a suburban spat. Martha immediately launched into a frantic, high-pitched tirade, pointing at Mark and David, waving her arms at the survey equipment, and spewing a torrent of HOA jargon and accusations. The senior deputy listened with a practiced, stoic patience, his eyes occasionally flicking over to Mark, who was standing calmly by his stone wall. When Martha finally wound down, the deputy walked over to Mark. "Afternoon, sir. I'm Deputy Miller. Can you tell me what's going on here?" "Good afternoon, Deputy," Mark said, his voice calm and respectful. "My name is Mark Hayes. This is my friend, David Chen, a licensed state surveyor. We're conducting a simple property survey on my land. That woman," he nodded towards Martha, "is the president of the neighboring HOA, and she seems to believe her authority extends beyond her subdivision's boundaries." He handed the deputy a copy of his property deed and his own driver's license. The deputy's eyes widened slightly when he read the name on the license. He didn't say anything, but a flicker of recognition, and perhaps understanding, crossed his face. He knew who Judge Hayes was. The deputy walked back to Martha. "Ma'am, he's on his own property, and a survey isn't construction. There's no violation of any law here." "But the bylaws!" Martha shrieked. "He's violating the bylaws." "Ma'am," the deputy said, his voice losing its patience, "we don't enforce HOA bylaws. That's a civil matter. You are currently impeding a legal survey and, frankly, wasting our time. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Defeated and humiliated in front of the very authority she had tried to wield, Martha shot Mark a look of pure venom. She stomped back to her car and sped off. The deputy tipped his hat to Mark. "Sorry about that, Judge." "Not your fault, Deputy," Mark replied. "Thank you for your time." As they drove away, Mark knew the police report from this incident would be another crucial piece of his mosaic. It documented, from a neutral law enforcement perspective, Martha's baseless accusations and her escalating erratic behavior. A week later, David's report arrived. It was a thing of beauty, a thick, spiral-bound document filled with detailed maps, legal descriptions, and supporting evidence. The boundary survey was precise to the inch, confirming that the cabin, the stone wall, and the meadow of wildflowers were all squarely and indisputably on Mark's land. But David had gone further. He had included copies of historical aerial photographs from the county archives dating back to the 1960s. The cabin was clearly visible in every single one, a small, solid presence on the landscape long before the first street of Maple Creek Estates was even paved. 3. The centerpiece of the report was a sworn affidavit. In it, David professionally attested to the cabin's age, based on his physical inspection of the construction methods, the aging of the timber, and the corroborating historical records. He concluded, under penalty of perjury, that the structure was built circa 1952, a full 58 years before the establishment of the Maple Creek Estates HOA. To top it all off, he included a printout of the HOA's own plat map from the county registrar, which showed Mark's property as a pre-existing, non-affiliated parcel. Armed with this ironclad document, Mark felt it was time to confront the beast in its den. He checked the HOA's website, a garish, poorly designed page featuring a smiling glamour shot of Martha, and found the date for their next monthly meeting. It was a public meeting, technically, though he suspected few residents dared to attend or speak out. It was time to change that. He wasn't going as a supplicant. He was going as a prosecutor, armed with a case so strong that any reasonable person would be forced to see the truth. He had given them a chance to retreat in writing. Now, he would give the board members, the silent partners in Martha's tyranny, a chance to see the evidence with their own eyes and publicly choose a side. He knew Martha would try to shut him down, but he was prepared. He had dealt with far more formidable opponents in his own courtroom. The HOA meeting was held in the clubhouse of the subdivision, a sterile beige room that smelled faintly of chlorine from the nearby pool. About 15 residents were scattered amongst the chairs, looking either bored or anxious. At the front of the room, Martha sat at a long table, flanked by two other board members, a nervous-looking man who kept adjusting his tie and a woman who stared blankly at her notepad, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Martha was in her element, presiding over the meeting with an iron fist. She spoke in a clipped, condescending tone, rushing through the agenda items about pool maintenance and landscaping contracts. When she finally announced the open forum for homeowner concerns, Mark stood up. "I'd like to address the board," he said, his voice calm but carrying easily through the quiet room. Martha's eyes narrowed as she saw him. "You are not a homeowner in this association," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Therefore, you have no standing to speak." "On the contrary," Mark replied, walking to the front of the room. "Since your board has been actively harassing me, fining me, and threatening to seize my property, I believe I have more standing than anyone. I'd like to present evidence that proves your actions are not only baseless but malicious." He placed a copy of David's comprehensive survey on the table, in front of each board member. "This is an official survey and historical affidavit of my property," he announced to the room. "It proves, beyond any doubt, that my cabin predates this HOA by nearly 60 years, and that you have absolutely no jurisdiction over it. I trust you will find it enlightening." The other residents began to murmur, their interest piqued. They had never seen anyone stand up to Martha so directly, so confidently. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty, of fear, crossed Martha's face. Her control of the room was beginning to slip. Martha quickly recovered, her face hardening into a mask of pure fury. "This is not the proper venue for this," she snapped, pushing the bound report away from her as if it were contaminated. "We have procedures. You need to submit this through the proper channels to our legal counsel." "I believe I tried that," Mark said calmly, his eyes sweeping over the other two board members, who were now nervously flipping through the pages of the report, their eyes growing wider as they saw the aerial photos and legal documents. "Your legal counsel was the one who sent me a threat to steal my cabin based on a bylaw you invented last month. I'm here to give you, the board, a chance to rectify this situation before you are held personally and financially liable for a malicious prosecution lawsuit." A gasp went through the audience. The words, "personally liable," had a powerful effect. The nervous man on the board, whose nameplate read, "Gary," looked up at Martha, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Martha, maybe we should look at this," he stammered. "This seems pretty definitive." "Silence, Gary," Martha hissed, shooting him a venomous glare. "He is out of order. This open forum is for members only and is limited to 2 minutes per person. Your 2 minutes are up, Mr. Hayes. Sit down, or I will have you removed for trespassing." Mark didn't move. He stood his ground, letting her authoritarian tantrum wash over him. He had accomplished his goal. He had planted the seeds of doubt in the minds of the other board members and, more importantly, he had shown the other residents that the Empress had no clothes. "I won't be removed," Mark said, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone that he usually reserved for sentencing criminals. "But I will leave you with this thought. Every action this board takes under Ms. Miller's direction exposes you all to significant legal risk. I have the evidence. I have the law on my side. And I have a great deal of patience. I suggest you think very carefully about your next move." He turned and walked out of the clubhouse, leaving behind a stunned silence and a tyrant whose authority had just been irrevocably cracked. Mark had become a subject of intense speculation within Maple Creek Estates. By directly challenging Martha in a public forum, he had done what no one else had dared to do. He had shown them that she was not invincible. He had hoped his presentation would be enough to make the other board members see reason and force Martha to back down. But he also knew that a cornered animal is often the most dangerous. He had poked the hornet's nest, and he had to be prepared for the swarm. He didn't have to wait long. Martha's ego, wounded by the public defiance, would not allow for a quiet retreat. She was too invested, too committed to her personal vendetta. She had to crush him to restore her dominance. The community, however, was beginning to stir. While Mark was a perceived outsider, his fight resonated with the residents who had been living under Martha's thumb. His calm, evidence-based approach was a stark contrast to her emotional, bullying tactics. People were starting to talk. Quietly at first, in hushed tones over backyard fences, and in private social media groups. They had seen someone fight back and not be immediately smitten. It gave them a sliver of hope. Mark, for his part, knew the HOA meeting was just a preliminary skirmish. The real battle would be fought in a courtroom. He began to organize his files with even greater care, preparing for depositions, filings, and discovery. He treated Martha and the HOA as a hostile party in a complex piece of litigation. He had given the board a clear off-ramp, a chance to avert disaster. By refusing to even look at the evidence, Martha had slammed the door on any peaceful resolution. She had taken her board and her entire community hostage in her personal war. Her next move, he predicted, would be the one she had been threatening all along. She would file the lawsuit, and in doing so, she would be walking, with her eyes wide open, directly into his trap. The first whispers of support came a few days after the meeting. As Mark was loading groceries into his car in the parking lot of the local market, a woman approached him tentatively. He recognized her from the HOA meeting. "Excuse me," she said, looking around nervously, as if Martha might pop out from behind a row of shopping carts. "You're Mr. Hayes, right? The man with the cabin?" "Mark," he corrected her with a warm smile. "And yes, that's me. I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What you did at that meeting, it was incredible. My husband and I have lived here for 5 years, and we've been fined for everything. The color of our welcome mat, a small crack in the driveway, and our basketball hoop being left out overnight. We just pay because we're afraid of what she'll do if we don't." She glanced around again. "There are more of us. A lot more. People are talking. If you end up needing witnesses or anything, some of us would be willing to speak up." She quickly scribbled her name and number on a napkin and pressed it into his hand before hurrying away. Later that day, he received an email from another resident, a man who had been forced to tear out a beautiful, custom-built children's playset because it wasn't a pre-approved model from the HOA's preferred vendor. He, too, offered his support and had records of all his correspondence with Martha. This was the turning point. Mark realized his fight was no longer a solo endeavor. He was becoming the champion for a silent, oppressed majority. He wasn't just defending a building, he was defending the right of these people to live peacefully in their own homes without fear of a petty dictator. He carefully saved the napkin and the email. The rallied community was no longer just a concept. It was becoming a reality. Each new story, each offer of support, added another layer of steel to his resolve. He wasn't just going to win his case. He was going to liberate a neighborhood. Martha's response to her public humiliation was predictable. Instead of backing down, she escalated. 2 weeks after the HOA meeting, a certified letter arrived. This one wasn't a notice or a threat. It was a formal summons and complaint. The Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association had officially filed a lawsuit against Mark Hayes in the county court. The legal document was thick with manufactured outrage and baseless claims. It accused him of creating a public nuisance, violating numerous and creatively interpreted bylaws, and refusing to comply with the lawful directives of the association. The relief they sought was an injunction forcing him to demolish the cabin at his own expense. Failing that, they asked the court to grant the HOA ownership of the structure so they could demolish it themselves and, of course, to award them punitive damages and all legal fees. It was, from a legal standpoint, a work of fiction. It completely ignored the jurisdictional issue, the cabin's history, and every piece of evidence Mark had presented. It was a pure bluff lawsuit designed to intimidate and overwhelm a defendant with the sheer cost and stress of a legal battle, hoping they would settle or give up. Mark sat at his desk and read through the entire document, a grim smile on his face. He felt a sense of relief. The waiting was over. She had finally done it, taking the final, irrevocable step. He picked up the phone and called the county courthouse clerk, a woman he'd known for 20 years. "Morning, Susan," he said. "It's Mark Hayes. I'm just calling to confirm receipt of a new filing, a civil suit. Maple Creek HOA versus Hayes. "Oh, good morning, Judge," she said cheerfully. "Yes, it came in yesterday. It's been processed and assigned." "And who was it assigned to?" Mark asked, though he already had a strong, sinking, and somewhat exhilarating feeling that he knew the answer. "Let me see here," Susan said, the sound of keyboard clicks in the background. "Ah, here it is. It's been assigned to you, Judge. It's on your docket for an initial hearing in 6 weeks." Mark closed his eyes. The universe, it seemed, had a flair for the dramatic. Mark spent the next few days in a state of deep contemplation. The legal and ethical implications of the situation were complex. Of course, he couldn't preside over his own case. That was a clear and absolute conflict of interest, the most basic rule in the judicial playbook. He would have to recuse himself at the earliest possible moment. But the way in which he recused himself, that was where he had some latitude. He could file a simple motion, a piece of paper that would quietly transfer the case to another judge. Martha would never even know he had been assigned it. Or he could wait. He could let the process play out until the first public hearing. He could let Martha and her lawyer walk into that courtroom, brimming with confidence, and then reveal the conflict in the most dramatic and public way possible. The first option was the simple, clean, professional route. The second was a little bit of legal theatre, a move that felt less like a judge and more like the blue-collar grandson of a carpenter, who had a deep-seated desire to see a bully get what was coming to them. It wasn't about revenge, he told himself. Not exactly. It was about exposing the rot. It was about making a statement, not just for his own sake, but for every other person Martha had tormented. A quiet recusal would resolve his case, but a public one would detonate a bomb in the middle of Martha's power structure. It would show the entire community just how reckless and foolish she had been. He thought of the damage to his grandfather's door, of the Hendersons being run out of their home over a mailbox, of the man who had to tear down his children's playset. His decision became clear. He would not file a motion. He would wait for the hearing. He would let Martha Miller walk into his courtroom. He would ascend to the bench, and he would let her look, for one long, terrifying moment, into the face of the very justice she had tried to pervert. It was a risky, unorthodox plan, but it was the only one that felt truly, deeply, right. With the court date set, Mark switched into full trial preparation mode. He spent his evenings and weekends not as a judge, but as his own legal counsel. He began by meticulously drafting his answer to the complaint. For every one of Martha's baseless allegations, he provided a detailed, evidence-backed rebuttal. He attached the key exhibits: the property deed, the surveyor's report, the historical photos, the photographs of the vandalism, and copies of his cease and desist letter. His answer wasn't just a denial. It was a narrative, a document that told the entire story of Martha's escalating harassment campaign. Next, he filed a counterclaim. This was his offensive move. He sued the Maple Creek Estates HOA for malicious prosecution, abuse of process, and property damage. He also took the significant step of naming Martha Miller personally in the counterclaim, along with the other 2 board members. This was piercing the corporate veil, arguing that their actions were so egregious and outside the scope of their duties that they should be held personally liable, not just the HOA as an entity. This meant their own personal assets were now on the line. He knew this would send a shockwave of terror through the other board members and isolate Martha completely. He also filed a motion for summary judgment, a legal maneuver arguing that the facts of the case were so clear and indisputable that there was no need for a full trial. He argued that based on the public record alone, the deeds, the plat maps, the HOA's case, had no legal merit and should be dismissed immediately. He was building a procedural cage for Martha, surrounding her with legal filings that demonstrated the utter futility of her position. Every document he filed was a model of clarity and precision, the work of a man who had spent his life reading, analyzing, and writing such things. He was not just fighting a case, he was conducting a masterclass in litigation. As the hearing date approached, Martha made another desperate, foolish move. She must have felt the pressure of Mark's professional counterfilings. Her lawyer was likely warning her that this was not the easy rollover she had expected. So, she tried to create new evidence. She called the County Code Enforcement Office and filed an anonymous complaint, claiming the 70-year-old cabin was an unsafe, dilapidated structure and a public health hazard. It was a transparent attempt to get a government agency to condemn the cabin, which would give her lawsuit a veneer of legitimacy. A week before the hearing, a county inspector named Frank, a burly, no-nonsense man with a clipboard and a weary expression, showed up at Mark's property. "Mark Hayes?" he asked. "Got a complaint about this structure. Have to take a look." Mark smiled. "Of course, Frank. Come on in. I'll give you the grand tour." He led the inspector through the cabin. He showed him the solid foundation his grandfather had set on bedrock. He pointed out the thick, hand-hewn beams, stronger and straighter than most modern lumber. He showed him the new wiring he'd installed himself a few years back, all up to code, and the solid plumbing. He tapped on the walls, solid as a rock. "It's old, I'll grant you that," Mark said. "But it's built to last. My grandfather didn't cut corners." Frank grunted, making notes on his clipboard. He checked the foundation, looked up at the roofline, and stomped on the floorboards. After a thorough 20-minute inspection, he shook his head. "I don't know who called this in, but they're an idiot," he said bluntly. "This place is built better than my own house. I'm marking this complaint as unfounded and malicious. Have a good day, Judge." He, too, recognized the name. The system was small. Martha's attempt to use another arm of the county government against him had backfired, creating yet another official report that painted her as a vexatious complainant. The walls were closing in on her, and she was far too blind to see it. The morning of the hearing arrived, a crisp autumn day. Mark woke up early, a strange sense of calm settling over him. He put on a simple, dark suit, the kind he would wear if he were a lawyer arguing a case, not the judge hearing it. He gathered his files, a thick, organized stack of evidence and motions. As he drove to the courthouse, he felt the weight of the last 6 months. It had started with a ridiculous letter about grass and had spiraled into a full-blown legal war, all because of one woman's insatiable need for control. He thought about the small community of supporters who had promised to be there, people who were pinning their hopes on his fight. This was for them as much as it was for him. He entered the courthouse through the public entrance, not the private one reserved for judges. He wanted to see the scene unfold from the outside. He saw Martha and her young lawyer standing in the hallway, looking smug. She was dressed in a severe-looking power suit, whispering conspiratorially with her attorney. She saw Mark walk past and gave him a triumphant, condescending smirk. It was the look of someone who believed they had already won, who saw him as just another bug she was about to squash. He ignored her, gave a brief, encouraging nod to the small group of residents from Maple Creek who had gathered on the benches, and slipped into the courtroom to wait. He sat in the public gallery, just another face in the crowd, watching the clock tick down. He listened to the murmur of the room. He heard Martha's lawyer telling her how they would file for a continuance if the judge seemed unfavorable. He heard her complaining that the defendant hadn't even bothered to hire a real lawyer. The dramatic irony was so thick, it was almost suffocating. In 5 minutes, the show was going to begin. And Martha Miller had no idea she was about to be the star. At precisely 9 o'clock, the bailiff, a man Mark knew well, stepped forward. He caught Mark's eye for a split second, a barely perceptible nod of understanding passing between them. He then turned to the room and intoned the familiar words. "All rise. The Court of Maple Creek County is now in session. The Honorable Judge Mark Hayes presiding." The name hung in the air. A confused murmur rippled through the gallery. Martha's lawyer froze, his hand halfway to his briefcase, a look of utter bewilderment on his face. He glanced at the court docket, then at the empty defendant's chair, then back toward the judge's chambers. The gears in his mind were grinding, trying to process an impossible situation. But it was Martha's face that was the masterpiece. Her smug smile faltered, then vanished. Her brow furrowed in confusion. "Mark Hayes," she whispered to her lawyer, the name tasting like poison in her mouth. "That can't be right. That's him. That's the defendant." Her lawyer was already turning pale, the full, catastrophic implications of the situation beginning to dawn on him. This wasn't just a complication. This was a professional nightmare. He had filed a frivolous, malicious lawsuit against a sitting judge in that judge's own court. And then, the door to the judge's chambers opened. Mark stepped out. He didn't look at Martha. He didn't look at her lawyer. He walked with a steady, deliberate pace to the bench. The silence in the room so absolute it was deafening. He stood before the high-backed leather chair, turned to face the stunned courtroom, and with a slow, sweeping motion, he pulled on his black judicial robes. It was only then that he allowed his gaze to fall upon Martha Miller. Her face was a frozen mask of horror. The predator had suddenly, irrevocably, found herself in the apex predator's cage, and the door had just slammed shut. Mark sat down, the familiar weight of the chair a comfort. He took a moment, letting the scene sink in, allowing the full impact of the reveal to saturate the room. He could see the panic in the eyes of Martha's lawyer, who was now desperately trying to get his client's attention, to make her understand the gravity of her miscalculation. But Martha was frozen, her gaze locked on Mark, the gears of her mind seemingly stripped and broken. The world she had so carefully constructed, a world in which she was the ultimate authority, had just been turned inside out. The man she had dismissed as a rustic nobody was sitting in the highest seat of power she could imagine. Mark picked up the gavel. He didn't bang it. Not yet. He just held it. He cleared his throat, and the sound was amplified by the microphone, seeming to boom through the silent courtroom. "Good morning," he began, his voice the calm, measured tone of a judge, yet carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of iron. "Let the record show that the first case on the docket today is Maple Creek Estates, HOA versus Hayes. The record should also show that I, Judge Mark Hayes, am the named defendant in this action." He paused, letting the official words codify the absurdity. "It is a foundational principle of our legal system that no person may be a judge in their own cause. Therefore, for reasons that should be glaringly obvious to all parties, I am recusing myself from this case. In my 15 years on this bench, I have never seen a lawsuit filed with such, let's call it bold, disregard for the readily available public record. It is a lawsuit that, on its face, appears to be entirely without merit and brought for the purposes of harassment. Such actions are a profound waste of this court's time and a mockery of the civil justice system." His words were a direct shot, a judicial condemnation delivered before the case had even begun. Martha's lawyer looked like he was about to be physically ill. Mark set the gavel down gently. "This court will take a brief, 15-minute recess. When we reconvene, the Honorable Judge Eleanor Miller will be presiding over this matter. She is a senior judge of this court, and I can assure you, she has very little patience for frivolous litigation." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible smile. Judge Miller was his mentor, a brilliant, tough-as-nails jurist, who was legendary for her ability to cut through legal nonsense and get to the heart of a matter. He knew she would take one look at this case and see it for the vindictive trash it was. "That is all," he said, and with a sharp rap of the gavel, he stood and exited back to his chambers, leaving chaos in his wake. The moment the door to the judge's chambers closed, the courtroom erupted in a cacophony of frantic whispering. The group of Maple Creek residents was buzzing, a mixture of shock and elation on their faces. They had come expecting a fight. They had just witnessed a public execution. Martha's lawyer was desperately trying to talk to her, his hands gesturing wildly, his voice a panicked hiss. "Martha, we have to withdraw the suit, right now. We have to apologize. You don't understand, this is a disaster." But Martha was catatonic, still staring at the empty judge's chair, unable to process what had just happened. The carefully constructed walls of her reality had been demolished. Mark, in his chambers, loosened his tie. He could hear the muted commotion from the courtroom. His plan had worked even better than he had imagined. The public reveal had done more damage to Martha's credibility than a year's worth of litigation ever could have. He had used the power and theatre of the court not to judge his own case, but to shine a harsh, unforgiving light on the malice of his accuser. Now, he would leave the rest to his very capable colleague. He had built the cage and sprung the trap. Judge Miller would deliver the final, crushing blow. 15 minutes later, the courtroom was called back to order. A different figure emerged from the chambers. Judge Eleanor Miller. She was a woman in her late 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that had intimidated lawyers twice her size for decades. She sat down, put on a pair of reading glasses, and stared down at the case file before her. She was silent for a full minute, the only sound in the room, the rustle of paper as she scanned the complaint, and Mark's detailed answer and counterclaim. Finally, she looked up, her gaze settling on Martha's lawyer. She removed her glasses. "Counsel," she said, her voice like cracking ice. "I have read the initial filings in this matter. I have read the plaintiff's complaint, and I have read the defendant's answer, which includes, I see, a professional survey, historical photographs, and the relevant public records. Am I to understand that your client, the HOA, is suing a man over a structure that is demonstrably older than the HOA itself, and which sits on a property over which the HOA has no legal jurisdiction whatsoever?" The lawyer stood, his face ashen. "Your Honor, we believe there are issues of..." "Issues of what, counsel?" Judge Miller cut him off. "Issues of common sense. This isn't a matter of legal interpretation. It's a matter of basic facts. Facts that were a matter of public record and which the defendant, Judge Hayes, clearly laid out for you and your client weeks ago. And yet, you proceeded. Why is that?" The lawyer stammered, unable to form a coherent answer. He looked at Martha for help, but she was still staring blankly, lost in her own personal twilight zone. "Let me rephrase," Judge Miller continued, her voice dangerously soft. "Are you and your client simply ignorant of the law, or are you deliberately using this court as a tool for personal harassment?" The question hung in the air, a sword of Damocles over the lawyer's career. The young lawyer, seeing his professional future flashing before his eyes, made the only choice he could. He threw his client under the bus. "Your Honor," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "my firm was retained by the HOA. We were acting on the information and directives provided to us by the HOA president, Ms. Miller." He gestured toward Martha. "Third, we were assured that the association's claims were valid." Judge Miller's sharp eyes shifted to Martha, who finally seemed to snap out of her stupor as her own lawyer implicated her. "Ms. Miller, stand up," the judge commanded. Martha, moving like a rusty automaton, slowly got to her feet. "Is it true, Ms. Miller," the judge asked, "that you were presented with evidence, specifically a professional land survey, that proved your association had no claim, and you chose to proceed with this lawsuit anyway?" Martha opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked around the courtroom, at the faces of her neighbors watching her, at the stone-faced judge, and for the first time, the full weight of her actions seemed to crash down upon her. The bylaws," she began to mutter. "The bylaws do not grant you the authority to annex your neighbor's property, Ms. Miller." Judge Miller said sternly, "That's called theft." The judge turned her attention back to the file. "I have seen enough. This court finds that this lawsuit is frivolous, vexatious, and brought in bad faith. Therefore, the plaintiff's case is dismissed, with prejudice." The final two words were a death sentence for the lawsuit. It could never be filed again. "Furthermore," she continued, "this court finds that the actions of the plaintiff constitute a textbook case of malicious prosecution. I am awarding the defendant, Judge Hayes, summary judgment on his counterclaim. The HOA and you, Ms. Miller, personally, will be responsible for all of his legal fees and punitive damages to be determined at a later hearing." With a final withering glare, she added, "Counsel, you and your client are sanctioned for abusing the judicial process. I expect a check for $5,000 made out to the county law library on my desk by the end of the day. We are adjourned." With a bang of the gavel, it was over. Martha Miller didn't just lose. She was annihilated. The aftermath was swift and brutal. As the residents filed out of the courtroom, they were abuzz with the news. The story of Martha's public takedown spread through Maple Creek Estates like wildfire. Her humiliation was absolute and complete. She had tried to use the law as her personal sword, only to find that she had thrown herself upon it. Her own lawyer, furious at the damage she had done to his reputation and his wallet, formally dropped her as a client in the hallway outside the courtroom, leaving her utterly alone. Mark emerged a few minutes later and was greeted by the small group of residents who had come to support him. The woman who had given him her number on a napkin rushed up to him, her eyes shining with tears of relief. "We can't thank you enough," she said. "You did it. You finally stood up to her for all of us." Mr. Abernathy, who had made the trip into town and watched the whole thing from the back row, clapped Mark on the shoulder. "My father always said, give a bully enough rope and they'll hang themselves. Looks like Martha brought a whole spool." The immediate legal victory was sweet. But Mark knew the real work was just beginning. The community had been fractured and terrorized by one person's ego. Now was the time to heal, to rebuild, and to ensure that no one like Martha Miller could ever hold that kind of power over them again. The court had provided justice. Now it was up to the community to provide the change. He had won the battle over his cabin, but now he had a chance to help an entire neighborhood win back its peace of mind. The fallout for Martha was a cascade of consequences. The news of the lawsuit, the public humiliation, and most importantly, the sanctions and the personal liability for damages sent shockwaves through the HOA. Gary, the nervous board member, and his silent colleague immediately resigned, wanting nothing more to do with the sinking ship of Martha's presidency. An emergency meeting was called, not by Martha, but by a petition signed by over half the residents of Maple Creek Estates. The community, once cowed and silent, had found its voice. The meeting was held in the same beige clubhouse, but the atmosphere was completely different. It was packed. People were standing along the walls. This time, they weren't there to be dictated to. They were there to take back their community. Martha, to everyone's surprise, showed up. She looked haggard and defeated, a ghost of her former imperious self. She tried to speak, to defend her actions, but she was shouted down. One by one, residents stood up and shared their stories. The fines, the threats, the constant harassment. It was a dam of resentment breaking open. In a unanimous vote, Martha Miller was not only removed as president, but was stripped of her membership on the board entirely. 1-0. A motion was then passed to hire an independent forensic accountant to conduct a full audit of the HOA's finances during Martha's tenure. They wanted to see just how much of their money had been spent on her personal vendettas. The age of the petty tyrant was over, brought down not just by a judge, but by the collective will of the people she had tried to dominate. Mark, who attended the meeting as an honored guest, watched with a sense of profound satisfaction. This was true justice. The weeks that followed were a period of healing and reform for Maple Creek Estates. Mark, at the request of the newly formed interim board, acted as an informal advisor. He helped them draft new, clearer, and fairer bylaws. They added a specific clause protecting pre-existing structures on adjacent properties, ensuring a fight like his could never happen again. They put caps on fines, created a transparent and impartial appeals process, and, most importantly, they rewrote the HOA's mission statement to be about community support rather than punitive enforcement. The forensic audit uncovered what many had suspected. Martha had been using the HOA's legal fund as her personal war chest, spending tens of thousands of dollars on frivolous legal threats against residents. This information was turned over to the authorities, and Martha soon found herself facing not just civil penalties but a potential criminal investigation for embezzlement. Her reign had ended in complete and utter ruin, a downfall entirely of her own making. The rallied community had transformed from a group of victims into a proactive, engaged neighborhood. They organized community barbecues, started a neighborhood watch, and planted a community garden on a patch of common land. The fear that had permeated the air was replaced by a sense of cooperation and relief. The silver SUV was eventually replaced by a for sale sign on Martha's perfectly manicured lawn. She and her husband sold their house at a loss and moved away, unable to bear the shame and the ostracism. Her sterile McMansion was bought by a young family with 3 kids, who immediately installed a brightly colored, unapproved, and utterly joyful basketball hoop in the driveway. No one said a word. One beautiful spring afternoon, nearly a year after the whole ordeal began, Mark was sitting on the porch of his grandfather's cabin. The sun was warm on his face, and the air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass, his own, cut to a reasonable height, and the blooming wildflowers along the stone wall. The scar on the front door where Martha had placed the tape was still there. A faint, pale rectangle on the weathered oak. He had decided not to sand it away. He left it as a reminder that peace is something you have to fight for, that heritage is worth defending, and that even the most entrenched bully can be brought down by the simple, unwavering power of the truth. He heard the crunch of gravel and looked up to see Mr. Abernathy's old truck pulling up, followed by a car carrying the family who had moved into the Hendersons' old house. They were all coming over for a small barbecue, a celebration of the quiet life they had reclaimed. Children's laughter soon filled the air, a sound that felt more at home here than the sterile silence Martha had tried to enforce. Mark looked at the sturdy little cabin, a structure of wood and nails and memory. It had been the target of a bitter and pointless war, but it had endured, just as his grandfather had predicted. It stood not just as a monument to his family's past, but as a symbol of a community's future, a future where neighbors helped neighbors, where rules were meant to serve people, not the other way around, and where the quiet dignity of a well-lived life was the most respected community standard of all. He had been taken to court for his home, only to find that he was the court, and in the end, justice had truly come home. As he watched the kids from the neighborhood chase fireflies in the twilight, a deep sense of contentment settled over Mark. His world, once threatened, was whole again. The ordeal had started as a personal battle to protect a piece of his own history, but it had become something much larger. It had been a lesson in the insidious nature of petty tyranny and the corrosive effect of unchecked power, even on the smallest of scales. Martha, in her arrogance, had seen his quiet life as a weakness. She had mistaken his love for peace as an unwillingness to fight. She never understood that the deepest principles are often the quietest, held by those who prefer to build things rather than tear them down. But when what they have built is threatened, their resolve becomes unbreakable. 0. G. The law, he mused, was a powerful tool. In the wrong hands, it could be a bludgeon, a weapon of intimidation and oppression, just as Martha had tried to use it. But in the right hands, wielded with precision, evidence, and a clear moral compass, it was a shield for the innocent and a sword for justice. His role as a judge had given him a unique, almost karmic opportunity to confront her. But the victory hadn't truly been won in the courtroom. It had been won in the quiet moments of preparation, in the meticulous gathering of facts, in the courage of the neighbors who finally spoke up, and in the simple, unshakable belief that what he was defending was right. The fireflies blinked in the gathering dark, little sparks of light against the deep blue of the evening. He thought of his grandfather and hoped he would be proud. The cabin was safe, the land was at peace, and a community had been reborn. And it all started because one woman picked a fight with the wrong man, in the wrong place, and ended up facing a reckoning she could never have imagined. Justice, like a well-built house, stands firm on a solid foundation.